Problems. Consumer Problems, Faulty Items, Ricky Pacheco, FCS 302. Objectives. After this presentation, I will be able to 1. Define a consumer. 2. Define consumer problems. 3. Define what a faulty item is. 4. Recognize a faulty item. 5. Know your consumer rights. 6. How to handle and report faulty items you may encounter. What is a consumer? A consumer is one who acquires goods and services for ultimate consumption or use by a person, family, or household. Consumers go shopping and purchase goods and services in their efforts to accomplish their own economic goals. The ultimate purpose of all economic activity is to satisfy consumer wants. Satisfaction is defined individually by each person when his or her desires and needs are fulfilled or gratified. Consumers must be involved in economic activities in order to accomplish their personal goals and achieve satisfaction. People's personal economics goals are often in conflict, and sometimes consumers must make difficult decisions among alternatives. For example, as an earner, you must want to demand a higher salary. This conflicts with your desire to not spend too much because prices are pushed up by increasing labor costs. While you may want the government to put ceilings on interest rates for consumer loans to reduce your borrowing costs, this conflict will with your desire to earn interest rate on your savings amount. The economic activities performed by consumers are described below. Earnings. A basic economic activity for most people is the gain from the performance of service, labor, or work, such as the salary or wage of a person, the profits of a business enterprise, and returns from an investment. About 66% of adults and employed for money income. Earning is production in the marketplace. The median household income in the U.S. is about $48,000. That is half of the 110 million households that incomes above $48,000. Household mean income is about $62,000. Since consumer goods and services cost money, most people work to earn money income so that they can spend. American earners are tremendous producers of services and goods. The typical U.S. worker puts in 39 hours a week and has a vacation of 2 weeks. Workers in other major industrial nations work fewer hours per week. Germany, 31. France, 33. United Kingdom, 34. Japan, 37. South Koreans average 52 hours per week. Consumers need to be shoplifted, demanding, discriminating, and concerned about getting their money's worth. Otherwise, they will pay too much money for the values received and sometimes be harmed. Consumers confront a variety of problems when shopping in a market-driven economic system impacted by economic form, the government, technology advances, and invested marketing. Consumers' problems exist because markets are imperfectly competitive and because the interests of sellers and consumers differ. One result is that consumers generally lack the ability to accurately evaluate quality and price information obtained from sellers. What are consumer problems? Consumer problems exist in the market. Mayer defines consumer problems as conditions that cause dissatisfaction in the process of selecting, using, or disposing of goods and services. 4 consumer problems exist. Consumer problem that exists, number 1, the inability or unwillingness of producers to fulfill satisfy consumer needs and interests. This results in things consumers do not want, such as dangerous and defective products, price gouging, product performance failures, delivery failures, deceptive advertisement, dishonored promises and warranties, and frauds as well as ripoffs. Problem number 2, a lack of consumer information on important matters such as performance, durability, likelihood of defects, and health and safety threats. It is difficult to get your money's worth in a marketplace that often offers insignificant information or effective choice making. Consumers experience problems in making healthy food choices, selecting good medical care, finding inadequate and fairly priced housing and transportation, avoiding high costs for banking and credit, and any number of services where quality is difficult to objectively measure. Information is crucial for consumers because it empowers them to effectively pursue their interests. Consumer problem number 3, a market system that does not resolve consumer grievances very easily or effectively. Consumer problem number 4. Underrepresentation of consumer interest in government occurs to the point where many public policy decisions overly favor producers' detriment of consumers. Consumers shop in informationally imperfect markets. Consumer problems always have existed in part because the world always has had informationally imperfectly competitive markets, and the market are worse today than any time in history. Reines argues that the information precision against a marketing, advertising, sales, promotion, and salesperson have made consumer unattainable. Seller efforts along with consumer deficiencies have created informationally imperfect markets for most goods. Examples of consumer complaints. Number 1, autos. Consumers complain about false advertisement being sold a living car. Credit and debit. Consumers complain about hidden fees and charges. The third one, landlords and tenants. Renters complain about the unhealthy, unsafe living conditions and lack of maintenance and repairs. Characteristics of failing markets are infinite competition in the marketplace due to seller efforts to restrict a consumer's freedom of choice among goods and services. Bad business practices drives out good business practices. Seller profiting the encouragement, misrepresentations, depictions, and frauds. Imperfect information due to the information, message, and seller control of most valuable information such as data on frequency of products needing repair. Number 5, consumers who are unable to process significant knowledge to ask appropriate questions to sellers or to make wise purchase decisions. 6, products that put consumers at greater risk than can be freely foreseen, such as unsafe toys and vehicles with poor safety records. Morally questionable marketing, such as promoting products that are inappropriate for certain age levels, making unnecessary emotional claims, and using scared technologies. 8, negative externalities are over-provided and difficult to avoid, such as produce from farmers who use techniques that can cause erosion and duplicate natural resources, such as well as products that cause water pollution. 9, positive alternatives and unprovided, such as information, safety, representation of consumers, competition, and awareness of wrongs. To address these market failures, consumers tend to demand a fair marketplace. They support laws and regulations to combine misrepresentations and depictions, as well as to mandate disclosures of information, enforce standards, obtain health and safety protection, and seek regulation of economic interests. Businesses that sell typically resist government intervention unless they believe it will help them or hurt their competitors. These imperfections in the marketplace of the power and precisely what brought the consumers movement into being. Informed consumers should realize that the enemy is always the status quo because today's market needs to be made better for tomorrow's consumers. Faulty items. What is it? Faulty items are a major fault where an item does not work as it is supposed to. Problems and faults with items you buy can be major or minor, and there are different issues for particular products. A major fault is one where the item does not work as it is supposed to. Examples of faulty items. Number 1, a new washing machine that fills up with water but does not spin or empty out. Number 2, a new toaster that does not heat up. Number 3, a new blender that does not blend. The consumer interest is about value for money and equality. Specifically, the consumer's interest is concerned with securing, protecting, and asserting consumer rights, primarily in marketplace transactions, in order that all consumers receive an acceptable quality of goods and services at fair low prices. Thus, the consumer interest has to do with both value for money for oneself and equity for others. The emphasis of the definition on the consumer interest occurs primarily in marketplace transactions. It is because that is where consumers do what they do when they perform the consuming function. Also note that each consumer has his or her own definition of acceptable quality. Thus, one consumer might only purchase goods that are considered friendly to the environment or made by someone who was paid a fair wage. Another consumer might demand that the worker be employed in safe working conditions by a socially responsible company that did not discriminate in hiring practices or neglect the needs of economical disadvantage. Yet, another consumer might ignore such considerations when making a purchase. Furthermore, each consumer has his or her own definition of a fair or low price, and these vary over time for each product or service purchase. Consumer interest Number one, seeking value for money. Americans spend a lot of time in their consuming roles, such as going shopping malls, buying groceries, eating meals in restaurants, buying automobiles, paying for gasoline, and living in homes. They are looking for good values for their money. In that search, consumers consistently make trademarks between price and quality in marketplace transactions where there is imperfect information available to consumers. A trade-off is the act of giving up one good or activity in order to obtain another good or activity. This involves an exchange of one thing in return for another, especially giving up something desirable as a benefit or advantage for another benefit or advantage regarded more desirable. While pursuing value for money in the marketplace, consumers often make insufficient trade-offs. Here, consumers make poor quality and or price decisions. This occurs because consumers operate in a complex and technological marketplace where during marketplace transactions they are often lacking in legal strength, product knowledge, capacity, resources, organizations, and willingness. Thus, they frequently operate at disadvantage to the sellers who are experts in shop-specific product production and selling techniques. Protection. Federal Trade Commission Act, FTC. What is it that they do? Outlaws unfair methods of competition and outlaws unfair acts or practices that affect consumers. 2. Takes complaints about businesses that don't make good on their promises or cheat people out of money. 3. Shares complaints with law enforcement partners and use them to investigate fraud and eliminate unfair business practices. The U.S. approach to consumer protection is flawed. The United States approach to government protecting consumers. All Western European countries and those throughout Asia and Africa have taken a consumer protection as an important role for their federal government, much more so than the U.S. We have federal departments of commerce, trade, agriculture, communities, environment, transportation, health, foods and drugs, product safety, homeland security, and defense. These federal agencies look after, protect, and promote the special interest of their constitutions. But we have no agency with a primary responsibility to protect consumers and promote their interest and value for money and equality. The creation of a powerful U.S. Consumer Protection Agency was defected by businesses in the 1970s. The Federal Office of Consumer Affairs was closed, another win for business. In the 1990s, the federal model in the U.S. protects consumers indirectly rather than directly, as consumers cannot call a federal agency in the United States to obtain help with a consumer problem. You can call to complain and your complaint will be registered, but that's it. U.S. federal agencies cannot and will not help consumers resolve marketplace problems. The American consumer's only resource is to seek assistance from a state agency or a local organization, if available. And there are precious few. That typically is woeful short of funds, unstaffed, and lacking in legal authorities to seek and obtain remedies for individual consumers. Conflicts between the public and consumer interest. Conflicts between the public and consumer interest typically arise when the cost of providing increased safety and protection for all consumers are likely to push certain pieces up. And that is not the consumer's interest, and or additional consumer problem might be created by approval of a particular proposal. And most often these are attempts to reduce consumer rights. Number one, potential price increases. When consumers buy low-priced imported products such as cotton shirts and blouses from developing countries, their low-priced consumer interest conflicts with the public concern to protect American textile jobs. Other examples include requiring no-fault automobile insurance that limits the public's ability to sue, and requiring impact-resistant doors on vehicles that increase purchase costs. Number two, consumer rights. While many will argue that the consumer interest is to have 100% safe food supply, government acts in the public interest by permitting approved limits of dozens of chemical and individual and foods that may be unsafe in high concentrations, typically because such chemicals obtainably increase the harvest. Similarly, requiring automatic recessive resistant systems on new vehicles save the lives of many people, more than 3,000 annually, but it also increases purchase costs for the buyer. How consumers pursue their interests. It is accurate the voices of about 300 million consumers are heard in the American economic marketplace in their daily decisions to buy or not to buy. Consumers need to be responsible in pursuing their interest. In doing so, people will improve their own consumer education and will help them better future choices because they will not regret them. And when and would not do so even if they had better information and understanding. In a market-oriented capitalist economic, one group has its primary function to consume. Consumers should organize to better represent their own interests, to more effectively pursue or perceive a set of consumer interests over those of other consumer groups, and to encourage governments to support the consumer interests more often as act in the public interest. Turner observes that it is very difficult for an individual or household to do much by themselves. Therefore, they must get into groups to demand their prices and quality. Turner says that the thrust of participatory democracy is the ideological background of the consumer movement. Deeply rooted in American history, consumerism is like the American Revolution. In its behalf, that power ought to flow from the bottom up. That is, from the people up, rather than the people down, from the kings down. Thus, sellers need to meet regularly with consumers to provide participatory access for them to make inputs into the corporate decision-making process. Thus, being affected by decisions, consumers ought to be a part of the process of decision-making in corporations and governments. Turn includes that consumers are to economics what voters are to politics. Consumers with rights enhance the wealth of the nation. The great majority of consumers, probably 60% of the total, go about their consuming with a less than perfect understanding of how to find acceptable quality goods and services at fair to low prices. The muddle through the marketplace, often spending too much money for the values received. There are only relatively small numbers of consumers, perhaps only 20%, who are well informed in many areas of buying. There are a minority who are engaged, educated by choices and wise considered actions. Many of these are aggressive, assertive consumers because in addition to knowing about their consumer rights, they seriously pursue getting their money's worth in the marketplace. These consumers are the ones most likely to get redress when wronged by business because they are savvy and empowered. Their actions help policy the marketplace, and such efforts help improve markets for all consumers. Vulnerable or disadvantaged consumers need special protection. The president of Consumers Union, publisher Consumer Rights Magazine, says the vulnerable consumers cannot afford the basic necessities of life, and they have to fight for affordable goods and services. Fair financial practices in a society in which all Americans and their families have a fair chance at a decent living. They include people who are economically poor, young children, mentally retarded, severely disabled, non-English speaking, and some elderly people. This group comprises perhaps 20% of the population experience varying degrees of difficulty in buying. Unscrupulous consumers, when left unprotected in the marketplace, are the targets of unconscious business practices. It is a challenge to be an effective consumer pursuing the consumer's interests. While it is easy to simply go out and spend money, the real effort comes in obtaining good quality for a fair or low price. It is challenging to take actions to secure, protect, and assert our consumer rights. It takes time and effort to complain to a store manager or to a government agency about a problem. It takes personal commitment to become effectively involved in local, state, national consumer organizations that work to protect the rights of consumers. Nevertheless, the voices of consumers need to be heard on matters that affect them in the regular and political arenas in Washington and state capitals and in town meeting across America. Your right as a consumer. Your consumer rights protect you when you buy goods and services. This means you have rights by law, which a shop or service provider can't change. There are 4 rights. Number 1, the right to safety, protection from hazardous goods. Number 2, the right to be informed. Number 3, the right to choose. Number 4, the right to be heard. In March 1962, John F. Kennedy presented the first presidential message to Congress directed at consumer concerns. He asked for legislative action and new programs in several areas. The most important transcendent aspect of this message, however, was the now infamous Consumer Bill of Rights. Kennedy stated that consumers have 4 rights. Again, that's the right to safety, the right to be informed, the right to choose, the right to be heard. This message provided a great surge of interest in consumer concerns. Consumer problems remained in the news. President Kennedy established a Consumer Advisory Council to assist his counsel and economic advisors. The drug scandal resulted resulted in the birth of over 20,000 deformed babies around the world. Although few occurred in the United States, the congressional hearing prior to passage of the drug amendments revealed scandalous information about large numbers of ineffective and useless drugs being sold to unsuspecting Americans. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson created a new White House position, Special Assistant to the President for Consumer Affairs. He appointed Esther Peterson to the spot. She was well qualified, and she had previously served as director to the Department of Labor's Women's Bureau under the Kennedy administration. With White House visibility, consumers' concerns became front-page news. Later that year, Johnson sent a consumer message to Congress urging passage of several new laws. These, indeed, were existing times for consumers and consumer advocates, and the Liberal landslide in the 1964 election gave strength to those calling for reforms. Ralph Nader's call for volunteers to come to Washington to research and become active on consumer issues resulted in hundreds of people joining. The Washington Post writer William Greeter called Nader's readers. The consumerism era brought on a number of events. Number 1, housewives boycotting supermarkets because of high meat prices. Number 2, exposes in the form of books, news articles, and radio and television programs. Number 3, the formation of numerous local consumer action groups. 4, a flurry of legislative action on national and state levels. 5, scandals concerning fabrics, drugs, foods, credit, and product safety. 6, further presidential support by Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard M. Nixon through more consumer messages. Number 7, introduction of consumer education courses in many schools. 8, intentions, and 10, a general wandering of support from consumer concerns. In 1968, the Consumer Federation of America was formed. Its strength came from nearly 200 other consumers organizations that were members. It lobbied from consumers and pushed for more government intervention in the marketplace. The primes was the consumers needed more than information to make wise decisions. They needed strong voices to speak and leaders to fight for them. These years saw the ism and consumerism became appropriate and won quiet consumers, organized and spoke out to many issues of justice and fairness. Active leaders were almost militant in promoting the moral and ethical rights of consumers. In response to consumerism, businesses and government had different responses to the demands of consumers through the years. Businesses tended not to listen, took few positive actions, and typically remained in consumerism issues. Government listened and took a number of actions to help consumers. Business response. The social consciousness of the early 1960s, raising incomes of consumers and high expectations of quality suggested primarily by advertising were signs that could have predicted the consumerism of the time. A greater number of Americans had money and wanted quality goods and services. A number of Americans had little money but still wanted those same goods and services. Businesses tried to provide what consumers wanted, but good quality and low prices were difficult to find. In the early 1960s, the typical business response was ignore the demands of the consumer activists and they will go away. Fear was the reason some business persons said, fight the consumerists. Save our free enterprise system. Some business persons said, the food industry rejected violently against Esther Peterson's modest proposal for a truth in packaging law, accusing her of being anti-American. Businesses' views about consumer issues were often grudging and negative. The overall response of businesses to consumers' demands for change in the 1960s was negative. The typical business response was stated by the editors of Business Week in 1969. Deny everything. Nearly everyone goes through a phase of shock when hallowed businesses' practices are questioned, and it is an automatic response. Blame wrongdoing on the small mingle companies and industries where fragmentation and ease of entry are the rule. The argument is popular that the major companies are blameless, but the small outfits must cut concerns to service. Discredit the critics. Hell, says one congressional staff meant. I've had publishers worried about circulation sales conducting an investigation down here, peddling stuff on the communist nature of consumerism based on 1942 documents. Hire a public relations person. A big campaign to modify public option is alluring, but as one PR man says, there is no sense in a PR campaign if you have nothing to say. Defying the legislation, trade associations, and Washington law firms are specialists in this, and it is passing weak regulatory laws is often effective, at least for a while. It worked for the tobacco industry in 1965. It also worked in respect to the truthing and packaging laws. Launch a fact-defining commute to find out whether anything really needs to be improved in the way the company does business. The food industry is deeply involved in this now. Actually do something, whether you think you are guilty or innocent. Increasing inflation begins in the mid-1960s, and raising unemployment combined with the louder voices of consumers advocates finally convinced businesses that consumerism was a force to be reckoned with. Businesses had to be dragged into the realities of the times. Because of the recurring attitudes of businesses, but the mid-60s and the historical business model of importer in existence since the 1500s had changed. Let the sellers beware. Big businesses was worried because consumers were upset and would not take it anymore. By 1972, big businesses decided to form a coalition of their chief executive officers and CEOs to gain political power. The Business Roundtable in 1978, that group was critiqued with defending the creating of a consumer protection agency with the federal government. On the positive side, some businesses started going along with the demands of consumers, especially when those calls for change did not cost much money on a few business leaders. Viewed the consumerism movement as an opportunity. Those who did sought help from consumer advocates, knowing that such action would at the very least help improve their public relations images and perhaps also result in empowered slaves. Government response. As consumer problems with price and quality persisted and complaints continued about the disquality between claims and performance, consumers looked for ways to fix the systematic poor attitudes of sellers. When the growing dissatisfaction were not met by corporations, consumers took their grievance to government. During the 1960s and early 1970s, the overarching belief was that informed consumers are essential to the fair and effective functioning of a free market economy. Congress chose as a major technique for regulating businesses, local, state, and federal legislature became the primary governmental response to consumer problems. If a problem arose, it seemed logical and not expensive to write a new law or regulation, start a special agency, and or create a commission to study the matter and make recommendations. Ralph Nader speculated that consumer legislation was likely to be only under one confrontation of interest, divided businesses groups and ununited consumer groups. Dozens of consumers protection bills were proposed and many were passed, although most were cosmetic gestures like the truth in packaging law to a prince. Many states and locals passed a number of laws and regulations in an effort to protect consumers. Examples included civil and criminal penalties against offenders, injunctions against unethical merchants, licensing of business services such as television and automobile repairs, mandatory posting of obtained rating for gasoline, prohibition or permit sales, promotions banned, advertising an item with significant qualities were not really available, and little FTC laws making it unlawful to use fraud or false present in sale or advertising on merchandise. However, putting laws on the books is one thing, and providing effective consumer protection is another. Weak and unforced consumer legislation results in inadequate consumer protection. The federal legislative rush to protect consumers during the 1960s and 1970s resulted in more than 500 bills being proposed, many for political reasons only. Less than 30 were made into law, and enforcement was typically weak. So Congress had passed laws that confronted all the major problems facing consumers: credit, warranties, product safety, cosmetics, medical devices, appliances, energy labeling, real estate, drugs, and food. More consumer protection laws were passed between 1965 and 1975 than during the previous 75 years. In addition, 4 regulators were established: Consumer Product Safety Commission, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and Environmental Protection Agency. In addition, the existing government organizations try to do a better job. How to avoid faulty items. Number 1, before you shop, do your research. Number 2, make sure the company has a license to sell. Number 3, read customer reviews on products you wish to buy. It's most likely that other customers have reviewed that product in which you are hoping to buy. Number 4, read over the company's warranties. Number 5, read over return and refund policies. What to do if you encounter faulty items. Return any damaged items. Some retailers replace or offer merchandise credit. Use the cooling off rule. Federal law gives buyers 3 days to cancel purchases of $25 or more. File a complaint with the Bureau of Federal Trade Commission. And lastly,